Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. The first one in particular takes us to a Sunday adventure of 5 friends that turned into a nightmare where one explorer became trapped, her body bent at an excruciating angle with her ribs cracking. While the second tragedy takes place deep inside an underwater cave. As always, viewer discretion is advised. The morning of October 7th, 2001 began like many autumn Sundays in upstate New York. Gage Caverns is a natural limestone cave system located near Horrifyingly, New York, which has long attracted explorers eager to witness its underground wonders. 5 friends, Edward Galbavy, Kevin Shaw, Shioku Kudo, Adam Dobson, and J.J. Bradingham, arrived at the cave entrance around 10:30 in the morning. They were a mix of experienced spelunkers and newcomers, all drawn by the thrill of exploring the underground world. Gage Caverns was well known among local cave explorers, featuring both wet passages containing underground streams and dry sections where water had long since carved out spaces before moving elsewhere. The group had carefully prepared for their excursion. Each person carried a helmet with a mounted light, backup flashlights, extra batteries, some water, and light snacks. They wore clothes that could get dirty. Old jeans, long-sleeve shirts, and sturdy boots with good traction for the slippery cave surfaces. More experienced members of the group carried small packs with emergency supplies, including a basic first aid kit. Before entering, they checked their equipment one last time and signed the cave register, a common safety practice that lets others know who is inside and when they should return. The October air was chilly, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. But they knew the cave would maintain a steady temperature of about 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, year-round. At approximately 11 a.m., they entered the cave through its main opening, a dark gap in the hillside that seemed to swallow the daylight. The entrance chamber was large enough for all 5 to stand comfortably, but as they moved deeper, the passages began to narrow. The group decided to explore the dry side of the cave first. This included a challenging section called the Balls Down Crawl, named for the uncomfortable but necessary technique of crawling with your body lying flat against the ground. The passage was so tight in places that they had to exhale to make their chests smaller just to squeeze through. For the first 2 hours, everything went according to plan. They took photographs and pointed out interesting features to one another. Around 1 p.m., they made their way back to a larger room known as the amphitheater, a spacious chamber where several passages meet. Here, they paused to rest, have a snack, and decide where to explore next. The amphitheater was impressive, about the size of a small classroom with a ceiling high enough to stand up straight. Several small openings led off in different directions, some barely visible as dark cracks in the walls. These unexplored side passages caught their interest. Shioku Kudo, a 28-year-old graduate student who had been caving only a few times before, was particularly curious about a narrow horizontal crack that seemed to lead to another chamber. The crack was about 2 feet, 60 centimeters wide, and perhaps 18 inches, 45 centimeters tall, large enough that a person might be able to squeeze through while lying on their side. Kudo, being smaller than the others, volunteered to check if the passage went anywhere interesting. The others watched as she lay down on her side and began inching into the narrow opening. The trouble began almost immediately. The passage didn't continue straight ahead as it appeared from the outside. Instead, it bent sharply to the right at a 90-degree angle just beyond where they could see from the entrance. As Kudo pushed forward, she had to twist her body to follow this unexpected turn. She managed to get her upper body through the bend, with her torso now pointing in one direction, while her legs extended straight back in the original direction she had entered, forming a 90-degree angle with her body. This awkward position quickly became dangerous. The crevice narrowed even further, just beyond the bend, pinching inward at exactly the spot where Kudo's ribcage now rested. As she tried to push forward or pull back, she found herself completely stuck. The rock pressed painfully against her ribs, preventing her from moving in either direction. The rough limestone edges dug into her sides, and the tight space restricted her breathing. Kudo was stuck. She called out to her friends, trying to keep her voice calm despite the growing panic she felt. Kevin Shaw and Edward Galbavy immediately came to help. They tried to guide her, suggesting different positions and movements that might free her. They tried pulling gently on her feet, then pushing on her shoulders, but nothing worked. The more she struggled, the more firmly wedged she became. The tight bend had created a natural trap, like a hook that easily catches but doesn't easily release. The painful reality of Kudo's situation soon became clear. Her body was bent sideways at more than a 90-degree angle, with her ribcage compressed against the unforgiving stone. Every breath was difficult and painful. She couldn't expand her chest normally, forcing her to take shallow breaths. Worse still, she couldn't move her arms into a position that would give her any leverage to push herself free. After many unsuccessful attempts to free her, the group realized they needed help. The cave's cool temperature, constant at around 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, posed an additional danger. With Kudo unable to move, her body temperature would slowly drop, potentially leading to hypothermia. Shaw volunteered to leave the cave and call for professional help, while the others stayed with Kudo to keep her spirits up and monitor her condition. Shaw made his way quickly through the cave, emerging into the afternoon sunlight around 1:30 p.m. He immediately contacted emergency services, explaining the situation and giving details about Kudo's location within the cave. Soon, local rescue teams were notified, including specialized cave rescue units and emergency medical technicians. Meanwhile, back in the darkness of the amphitheater, Kudo's situation was growing more uncomfortable by the minute. The pressure on her ribcage made each breath painful. The hard stone floor beneath her side numbed her arm and hip. Worst of all was the psychological stress, the darkness, the tight space, and the growing uncertainty about whether she could be freed all contributed to rising anxiety. The first rescuers began arriving at the cave entrance around 2:15 p.m. They carried specialized equipment designed for cave rescues: ropes, harnesses, communication devices, medical supplies, and tools for removing rock. They quickly organized into teams and began making their way to the amphitheater, where Kudo remained trapped. By 3 p.m., the first rescue team reached Kudo. A paramedic immediately checked her vital signs. Kudo had now been trapped for nearly 2 hours, and the effects were showing. Her lips had a bluish tint from the cold and restricted breathing, and she was shivering despite her efforts to remain calm. The rescue team's first attempts followed the same approaches that her friends had tried: different angles of pulling and pushing, lubricants to reduce friction, and gentle rocking motions to try to free her body from the crevice. However, the peculiar angle of her entrapment, with her torso bent sideways at more than 90 degrees and her ribs compressed by the narrowing passage, made these conventional rescue techniques ineffective. As the afternoon stretched into evening, more specialized rescuers arrived. Some had experience with similar cave rescues and brought additional equipment. They set up bright lights to better assess the situation and established a communication system to coordinate their efforts. By 5 p.m., Kudo had been trapped for nearly 4 hours, and concern was growing about her physical condition. The pain in her ribs had become nearly unbearable, and the cold was sapping her strength. Around 7:20 p.m., 2 experienced cave rescuers, Joe Armstrong and Ken Fortuin, arrived with specialized equipment, including small drills and chisels designed for removing rock in tight spaces. They recognized that the only way to free Kudo would be to carefully remove some of the rock that was trapping her. This process was slow and dangerous. Armstrong and Fortuin had to work in the cramped space, careful not to cause any rock falls or create dust that would make breathing even more difficult. They identified key points where removing small sections of rock would relieve the pressure on Kudo's body without compromising the stability of the surrounding cave. For over 90 minutes, they carefully drilled and chipped away at the rock. Each small piece removed provided a tiny bit more space. Throughout this ordeal, Kudo remained conscious but grew increasingly exhausted. She had now been trapped in her painful position for about 8 hours, twisted sideways with her ribs compressed and her breathing restricted. Finally, at just after 9 p.m., Armstrong and Fortuin removed enough rock that Kudo could be slowly eased out of the crevice. As she was freed, the pain of blood rushing back into her compressed tissues was intense. Rescue medics immediately wrapped her in warming blankets and began treating her for hypothermia and compression injuries. Her ribs were badly bruised, and she had lost feeling in parts of her side that had been pressed against the rock for hours. Rather than rushing her out of the cave, the rescue team allowed Kudo to rest and recover her strength for about an hour. They gave her warm fluids and monitored her condition closely. When she felt strong enough to move, They slowly helped her through the cave passages, supporting her every step of the way. At 10:20 p.m., almost 9.5 hours after becoming trapped, Shioku Kudo emerged from Gage Caverns into the cool night air. Waiting ambulance personnel immediately took her to a local hospital for further evaluation and treatment. Remarkably, despite her ordeal, she had suffered no permanent injuries, just severe bruising, temporary nerve compression, and the psychological impact of her frightening experience. In the aftermath, local caving experts like Tom Engel noted that there had been some confusion during the early stages of the rescue regarding how long Kudo had been trapped, potentially delaying the full-scale rescue response. He emphasized the importance of calling for help quickly in cave emergencies, recommending that if a trapped caver cannot be freed within about 15 minutes, outside help should be summoned immediately. While Kudo survived her horrific nightmare, the cave explorer in this next story wasn't as lucky to make it out alive. In the hills of Vermont, Albertson's quarry sits as a remnant of old mining operations. Over the years, groundwater filled the abandoned mine, turning it into a popular spot for cave divers. On May 29, 2005, Tim Gagnon, 43, and his diving partner John Weymouth arrived at the quarry that morning. The weather was mild as they set up their gear by the water's edge. Both men were experienced and certified cave divers who had explored this site many times before. We all know that cave diving is much more dangerous than regular diving. It requires special equipment and training since divers enter enclosed spaces far from the surface. If something goes wrong, you can't just swim up to safety. The limited space, darkness, and distance from open air create risks that ordinary divers never face. Many cave divers say it's like exploring another planet, beautiful but completely unforgiving of mistakes. By 10 a.m., both men were ready. Their equipment included twin tanks holding compressed air, about 3,000 psi, regulators to breathe the air, powerful underwater lights, and guidelines, ropes that help divers find their way back. Cave diving equipment is more complex than regular scuba gear, with redundancy built into every critical system. This backup equipment can mean the difference between life and death in an emergency. The water was cold, around 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, requiring them to wear thick protective dry suits. These suits keep water completely off the diver's body, unlike wetsuits that allow a thin layer of water to be warmed by body heat. As they descended into the quarry, sunlight faded quickly. Within moments, their world shrank to what their dive lights could illuminate, narrow beams cutting through the darkness. The underwater tunnels were created by miners years ago, who had no idea their workplace would someday become an underwater maze. Silt covered the floors, which could easily cloud the water if disturbed, making it impossible to see. Cave divers call this a silt out, and it's one of the most common dangers they face. One wrong kick or hand movement can trigger a cloud of fine particles that may take minutes or hours to settle. Following proper safety procedures, Gagnon and Weymouth used a permanent guideline in the main tunnel. This rope, attached to the walls, would lead them back to the entrance even in zero visibility. They went about 600 feet, 183 meters, into the quarry before reaching the end of this main line. For perspective, that's about twice the length of a football field, all underwater in nearly complete darkness. At this point, they used what's called a jump reel, a smaller line that connects to another permanent guideline, allowing them to explore a different tunnel safely. This technique prevents divers from getting lost in branching passages. After a short distance along this new path, they decided to turn back, perhaps noticing their air consumption or simply following their pre-planned dive schedule. During their return journey, disaster struck. Weymouth's main regulator failed and began free-flowing, meaning air was rushing out uncontrollably. At 109 feet, 33 meters underwater, this was extremely dangerous. A free-flowing regulator can empty a full tank in minutes, leaving a diver without air deep underground with no quick escape to the surface. Gagnon immediately followed emergency procedures, offering Weymouth his backup regulator on a long hose. This setup, known as a Hogarthian configuration in technical diving circles, allows divers to share air while maintaining proper positioning. It meant they could continue moving toward the exit, with Weymouth leading and Gagnon following closely behind. For a while, this emergency plan worked. They moved steadily along the guideline, about 2/3 of the way back. The tunnel was dark and narrow in places, requiring careful movement to avoid stirring up silt or bumping into the rocky ceiling or walls. Their dive lights created moving shadows that made distances difficult to judge. Then, about 400 feet, 122 meters from the entrance, Weymouth suddenly felt the air hose pulled from his mouth. The loss of his air source underwater would have triggered immediate panic in an inexperienced diver. With his own regulator still leaking but providing some air, Weymouth made the difficult decision to continue toward the exit, hoping Gagnon would follow. This choice, whether to turn back and search for his partner or continue to safety, likely took only seconds to make, but would have consequences that lasted forever. Weymouth surfaced alone, his tanks nearly empty with less than 500 psi remaining. For reference, many recreational divers consider 500 psi to be their absolute minimum reserve, the point at which they must end their dive immediately. There was no sign of Gagnon. Weymouth immediately called for help from shore, likely still hoping his partner had found another way out, or was making his way to the surface. His hands trembled as he removed his gear, eyes constantly scanning the water's surface for bubbles, or any sign of movement that might indicate Gagnon had found an alternative exit from the submerged labyrinth. Rescue divers arrived quickly and searched throughout the day, but couldn't find Gagnon. As hours passed, hope dimmed. Cave rescues are notoriously difficult. The same features that make caves challenging to explore make them equally challenging for rescuers. Visibility was further compromised as the search teams disturbed the delicate silt, creating clouds that reduced sight to mere inches in some areas. Despite using advanced sonar equipment and following the guideline meticulously, the rescue team found no trace of the missing diver as daylight faded. The next day, recovery divers found his body on the tunnel floor, about 400 feet from the entrance at a depth of 109 feet, 33 meters. He was positioned as if he had been attempting to follow the guideline, one hand still reaching forward. When examining Gagnon's equipment, investigators found something strange. One tank still had plenty of air, about 2,000 psi, but the valve connecting it to his breathing system was closed. Normally, this valve stays open during the entire dive. The presence of air in his tank made the tragedy even more puzzling and heartbreaking. Survival had been literally inches away, locked behind a closed valve. Fellow divers who knew Gagnon personally confirmed he was meticulous about equipment checks and had never previously experienced valve issues during his 15 years of technical diving experience. The discovery left the entire dive community questioning how such a fatal oversight could happen to someone with his expertise. Investigators believe that while focusing on helping his partner and navigating the low ceiling tunnel, Gagnon might have accidentally bumped his tank valve against the rocky ceiling, turning it off. The valve sits at the top of the tank, behind the diver's head, making it vulnerable to accidental contact with overhead surfaces. In the dark, confined space, he probably didn't realize right away why his air stopped flowing. The tunnel where he was found had several tight restrictions where the ceiling dropped significantly, forcing divers to adjust their trim and swimming position to pass through safely. Examination of his equipment showed slight scrape marks on the top of his tank, supporting the theory of accidental contact. At that depth, a diver without air can lose consciousness in less than a minute. The human body simply isn't designed to go without oxygen, and the increased pressure underwater accelerates the effects of oxygen deprivation. The distance to safety, combined with the difficult passage and emergency situation, created conditions that Gagnon couldn't overcome. Medical experts consulted after the recovery explained that at 109 feet, 33 meters, the partial pressure of oxygen in the bloodstream depletes rapidly when breathing stops. Even an experienced diver like Gagnon would have had only about 15 to 20 seconds of useful consciousness to identify and correct the problem before cognitive functions became severely impaired, making any self-rescue attempt nearly impossible in such challenging conditions.